In the dying light of a winter evening, somewhere deep in the forests of medieval Europe, a traveller hurries along a narrow path. The wind carries strange sounds through the trees, sounds that make him quicken his pace and pull his cloak tighter against the cold. Behind him, something follows. Not the measured footsteps of another human, but something else entirely. Something that moves with purpose through the undergrowth. It's breathing heavy and laboured, almost like a man, but not quite. The traveller breaks into a run, but it's too late. What emerges from the shadows is neither fully human nor fully beast. It walks upright like a man, but its limbs are too long, its movements too fluid, too predatory. Its eyes reflect the pale moonlight with an intelligence that is terrifyingly human, yet driven by an hunger that is purely animal. This is not a creature born of nature's design. This is something else entirely. Something that was once a man, but has been twisted, transformed, made into a monster. But here's what makes this tale truly chilling. This transformation didn't happen by accident. It wasn't the result of some ancient curse or divine punishment. No, this monster was created deliberately, methodically, by human hands and human knowledge. The werewolf, as we've come to know it, is not just a creature of folklore. It is humanity's own dark invention, a monster we built from our deepest fears and our most dangerous ambitions. Welcome to Vanishing Legends, where we uncover the hidden truths behind the world's most enduring mysteries. If you're fascinated by the dark corners of human history and the monsters that lurk there, you're going to want to subscribe to this channel right now, because what I'm about to reveal will change everything you thought you knew about one of history's most terrifying creatures. Today, we're going to unmask the werewolf, but not in the way you might expect. We're not here to debunk the myth or explain it away with rational thinking. Instead, we're going to expose something far more disturbing. We're going to show you how the werewolf was systematically created, refined, and weaponized by human society itself. How ordinary men and women were transformed into monsters, not by the bite of some supernatural beast, but by the very communities they once called home. You see, the werewolf isn't just a story we tell to frighten children. It's a blueprint, a manual for how to destroy a human soul so completely that what remains is no longer recognizable as human at all. And the most terrifying part, this blueprint was used again and again across centuries of human history. Real people were turned into real monsters, not through magic, but through a process so methodical, so deliberate, that it makes the supernatural version seem almost merciful by comparison. What I'm about to show you spans over 1,000 years of documented history. We'll journey through the witch trials of medieval Europe, where the accusation of lycanthropy was used as a weapon of social control. We'll examine the psychological techniques used to break human minds so completely that victims would genuinely believe they had transformed into beasts. We'll uncover the political machinery that turned neighbour against neighbour, using the fear of the werewolf to justify unspeakable acts of violence and control. But this isn't just a historical curiosity. The methods used to create these human monsters, the psychological techniques employed to shatter human identity, the social mechanisms that allowed entire communities to participate in this transformation, these tools didn't disappear with the end of the medieval period. They evolved, adapted, and continue to shape our world today in ways that most of us never recognize. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand that the werewolf represents something far more dangerous than any supernatural threat. It represents humanity's capacity to systematically destroy what makes us human, to transform our neighbors, our friends, even our family members into something monstrous. And perhaps most chilling of all, you'll recognize the signs of this transformation happening around us right now. The true horror of the werewolf isn't that it might exist somewhere out there in the darkness. The true horror is that we created it, we perfected it, and we never stopped using it. The werewolf walks among us still, but not in the form you might expect. To understand how humans learn to manufacture monsters, we need to go back to the very beginning. Back to a time when the line between civilization and wilderness was thin, precarious, and constantly under threat. Back to the forests of early medieval Europe, where something far more complex than simple superstition was taking root. The year is 1161, and we find ourselves in a small village on the edge of what would become modern-day France. The harvest has failed for the third year running, and winter approaches with the promise of starvation. But the villagers have bigger concerns than empty granaries. Children have been disappearing, not taken by wolves or bears, as one might expect, but by something that leaves human footprints leading into the forest, footprints that seem to change, to elongate, to become something else entirely as they move deeper into the woods. The village priest, Father Benedict, has been receiving confessions that keep him awake at night. Hunters speak of glimpsing figures moving through the trees on two legs, but with movements too fluid, too predatory to be entirely human. Mothers whisper of shadows at their windows, shadows with eyes that reflect the firelight with an intelligence that is both familiar and utterly alien. But here's where our story takes its first dark turn. These accounts, these testimonies, they don't emerge spontaneously from the fears of simple peasants. They are being carefully cultivated, methodically encouraged, shaped by voices of authority, who have their own reasons for wanting the community to believe in monsters. Father Benedict himself has been reading from texts that didn't exist a century earlier, manuscripts that describe in precise detail the signs of lycanthropic transformation. He speaks from the pulpit about the theological implications of humans who surrender their souls to become beasts. He provides his flock with the exact symptoms to watch for, the specific behaviors that indicate a neighbor has been infected by this supernatural curse. And the people listen. They watch. They begin to see exactly what they've been told to look for. This is where the manufacture begins. Not with magic or supernatural intervention, but with the systematic implantation of a specific set of beliefs, fears, and expectations into a vulnerable population. The werewolf doesn't create itself. It must be taught, cultivated, brought into being through a process that is both psychological and social. What Father Benedict and others like him understood, perhaps instinctively, was something that modern psychology would later codify as the power of suggestion, social conformity, and mass hysteria. They discovered that if you could control what people believed about the nature of humanity itself, if you could convince them that the boundary between human and beast was fragile and easily crossed, then you could create the very monsters you claim to be fighting against. The process was elegant in its simplicity. First, establish the theoretical framework. Explain to the community that lycanthropy is real, that it follows specific patterns, that it can be identified through particular signs. Second, create the social pressure that makes accusation inevitable. When children disappear, when crops fail, when disease strikes, provide the community with a ready explanation that points not to random misfortune, but to a specific, identifiable cause. Third, and this is crucial, make the accusation of lycanthropy impossible to disprove. Create a system where denial becomes evidence of guilt, where the absence of obvious supernatural signs is interpreted as proof that the accused has become particularly cunning in concealing their true nature. What emerged from this process wasn't just a belief in werewolves. It was a machine for creating them. Because once the accusation was made, once the community had identified its monster, the real transformation could begin. And this transformation happened not to the accused alone, but to everyone involved in the process. The accusers became something other than human as they participated in acts of violence and cruelty that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The witnesses became complicit in a collective delusion that required them to ignore evidence, suppress empathy, and participate in rituals of destruction. The community itself became monstrous as it turned its collective power against individuals who had been marked for elimination. But perhaps most chilling of all, the accused often became exactly what they were accused of being, not through any supernatural transformation, but through a psychological process so complete, so devastating, that it shattered their sense of human identity entirely. Isolated, tortured, stripped of every connection to their former life, many genuinely came to believe that they had indeed become beasts. This is the true genesis of the werewolf. Not a creature of the wild forest, but a product of human civilization at its most sophisticated and most ruthless. A monster created not by accident or supernatural force, but through the deliberate application of psychological techniques that were refined over centuries of use. And this was just the beginning. What started in small medieval villages would eventually grow into something far more systematic, far more dangerous. The techniques pioneered by figures like Father Benedict would be codified, institutionalized, and deployed on a scale that would dwarf anything the medieval world could have imagined. The werewolf had been invented. Now it needed to be mass-produced. The machinery of monster making that emerged from these medieval experiments didn't remain confined to small villages or isolated communities. It spread, evolved, and found new forms of expression as European society itself transformed. By the 15th century, what had begun as localized episodes of mass hysteria had crystallized into something far more systematic and infinitely more dangerous. The key breakthrough came with the development of what we might call the institutional werewolf. No longer was the creation of monsters left to the whims of village priests or local authorities. Instead, it became codified, standardized, and deployed as an instrument of social control by the most powerful institutions of the age. The Catholic Church, already experienced in identifying and eliminating heretics, found in lycanthropy a perfect complement to its existing arsenal of accusations. Unlike heresy, which required theological sophistication to prosecute effectively, lycanthropy could be understood and feared by anyone. A peasant who couldn't read Latin could still recognize the signs of bestial transformation. A child could identify the telltale behaviors that marked someone as no longer fully human. But the church didn't simply adopt the werewolf wholesale. They refined it, perfected it, turned it into a precision instrument. The Malleus Maleficarum, that infamous handbook for witch hunters, devoted entire sections to the identification and prosecution of lycanthropes. It provided detailed instructions for extracting confessions, guidelines for interpreting physical evidence, and theological justifications for the most extreme forms of punishment. What made this institutionalization so effective was its bureaucratic nature. The creation of monsters was no longer dependent on local hysteria or individual initiative. It became a process that could be replicated anywhere, deployed by trained professionals, and scaled up or down depending on political necessity. Consider the case of Peter Stuber, executed in 1589 in what is now Germany. Stuber's transformation from prosperous farmer to confessed lycanthrope didn't happen overnight or through supernatural means. It was the result of a carefully orchestrated campaign that lasted months and involved dozens of participants. Each step in his destruction was documented, recorded, and later used as a template for similar prosecutions across Europe. If you're finding this as disturbing as I am, you're definitely going to want to hit that subscribe button right now, because here on Vanishing Legends, we don't just scratch the surface of these historical mysteries. We dig deep into the mechanisms that shaped human civilization, and what we uncover isn't always comfortable to confront. The process began with isolation. Stubbe was gradually separated from his support networks through a series of seemingly unrelated incidents. His closest friends began to avoid him after rumors spread about strange behavior. His business relationships deteriorated as partners found excuses to end their associations. His family members were subtly pressured to distance themselves through threats that were never quite explicit but were unmistakably clear. This isolation served multiple purposes. It made Stubbe more psychologically vulnerable by depriving him of the social connections that normally anchor human identity. It removed potential witnesses who might contradict the accusations being prepared against him. And it created a social vacuum around him that could be filled with whatever narrative his accusers chose to construct. The next phase involved the systematic destruction of his reputation through what we would now recognize as a sophisticated disinformation campaign. Stories began to circulate about Stubbe's alleged nocturnal activities. Witnesses came forward claiming to have seen him in places where livestock had been killed. Children reported encounters with a figure that seemed to be Stubbe, but somehow different, more threatening, less human. These stories weren't random gossip. They followed specific patterns that had been established through decades of similar cases. They built upon each other in ways that created an increasingly comprehensive picture of supernatural threat. Most importantly, they were designed to be impossible to refute through normal means of evidence or testimony. When Stubbe denied the accusations, his denials were interpreted as proof of his cunning. When he provided alibis for his whereabouts during alleged incidents, those alibis were dismissed as evidence of his supernatural ability to be in multiple places at once. When he appealed to his previous reputation as a God-fearing member of the community, that very reputation became evidence of how effectively he had concealed his true nature. This is where the psychological sophistication of the werewolf creation process becomes truly apparent. The accusations weren't designed merely to condemn Stubbe in the eyes of the community. They were designed to make him question his own reality, to undermine his confidence in his own memories and experiences. Under prolonged interrogation, often accompanied by torture that was specifically designed to simulate the physical transformation into a beast, Stubbe began to doubt his own human nature. Sleep-deprived, physically brutalized, and completely isolated from any source of emotional support, he started to experience what his torturers told him were the early signs of lycanthropic transformation. The final phase of the process involved Stubbe's public confession and execution. But this wasn't simply about punishing an individual. It was about demonstrating to the entire community the power of the institutions that had created this monster and destroyed it. The elaborate ritual of his death served as both entertainment and instruction, showing the population exactly what happened to those who were deemed to have crossed the boundary from human to beast. But here's what makes this case particularly significant for our understanding of how monsters are manufactured. Stubbe wasn't chosen randomly. He was selected because his destruction served specific political and economic interests. His land was valuable. His independence from local authority structures made him a target. His prosperity in a time of general hardship made him an object of resentment that could be easily redirected and weaponized. The werewolf accusation wasn't the cause of his destruction. It was the method. The monster wasn't something that possessed him or transformed him through supernatural means. The monster was something that was built around him, piece by piece, until it became indistinguishable from the man himself. This pattern was repeated thousands of times across Europe over the course of several centuries. Each case refined the techniques, identified new vulnerabilities, and demonstrated new applications for the werewolf creation process. What had begun as isolated episodes of mass hysteria evolved into a systematic technology for social control. The records from these cases, preserved in church archives and legal documents, provide us with an unprecedented window into the mechanics of monster making. They show us exactly how human beings can be stripped of their humanity, not through magic or supernatural intervention, but through the deliberate application of psychological pressure, social isolation, and institutional power. They also reveal something else, something that connects these historical cases to patterns we can observe in our own time. The creation of monsters serves a function beyond the simple elimination of inconvenient individuals. It teaches entire populations about the boundaries of acceptable humanity. It demonstrates what happens to those who step outside those boundaries, and it creates a shared experience of complicity that binds communities together through their participation in acts of collective violence. The werewolf trials of early modern Europe weren't just about identifying and punishing lycanthropes. They were about teaching entire societies how to recognize, isolate, and destroy anyone who was designated as no longer fully human. They were a rehearsal for forms of dehumanization that would later be deployed on scales that medieval Europe could never have imagined. The techniques pioneered in the werewolf trials didn't disappear when belief in lycanthropy faded. They were preserved, refined, and passed down through institutions that understood their practical value, even when the supernatural framework that had originally justified them was no longer credible. Modern psychology recognizes many of the methods used in werewolf creation as sophisticated forms of psychological manipulation. The isolation, the systematic undermining of reality, the use of physical stress to break down mental resistance, the creation of false confessions through a combination of pressure and suggestion. All of these techniques have been documented and studied in contemporary contexts. What the werewolf trials achieved was the development of a complete system for transforming human beings into something monstrous. Not just the accused, but everyone involved in the process. The accusers, the witnesses, the judges, the executioners, all became participants in a collective act of dehumanization that changed them as fundamentally as it changed their victims. This is the true legacy of the werewolf, not a supernatural creature that haunts the forests of medieval Europe, but a technology for creating monsters that has been passed down through generations of human civilization. A set of techniques that can be deployed whenever societies need to identify internal enemies, eliminate inconvenient populations, or demonstrate the consequences of stepping outside accepted boundaries of humanity. The werewolf walks among us still, but not in the form we might expect. It exists in every system that teaches us to see other human beings as less than fully human. In every institution that uses fear and isolation to break down individual resistance. In every community that participates in the collective dehumanization of those who have been marked as different, dangerous, or disposable. The monster was never in the forest. The monster was always in the village, in the institutions, in the systems of power that could transform ordinary human beings into creatures capable of unthinkable cruelty. And the most terrifying part of all is that this transformation is still happening, still being refined, still being deployed against new targets, in new contexts. The werewolf is humanity's darkest invention, and we never stop perfecting it. The transformation didn't end with the medieval period. If anything, it accelerated, evolved, and found new expressions as human civilization itself became more sophisticated. What we're about to explore next will show you how the werewolf creation process adapted to changing times, new technologies, and different social structures, but its core function remained terrifyingly consistent. By the 17th century, the methods developed in those early werewolf trials had been refined into something approaching an exact science. The process was no longer dependent on superstition or religious fervor alone. It had become a practical tool that could be deployed by anyone who understood its fundamental principles. And if you're still with me at this point, you're clearly someone who wants to understand the deeper mechanisms that shape human behavior and social control. That's exactly what we dive into here on Vanishing Legends, so make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, because what comes next is going to challenge everything you thought you knew about how monsters are really made. The key innovation of this period was the development of what we might call the portable werewolf. The techniques no longer required elaborate institutional support or specific religious frameworks. They could be adapted to any social context, any political system, any cultural background. The core psychological principles remained the same, but their application became infinitely more flexible. Consider what happened in the New World colonies, where European settlers brought these monster-making techniques with them, but had to adapt them to entirely different circumstances. Here, the werewolf took on new forms, new names, but the underlying process remained unmistakably familiar. The Salem witch trials represent perhaps the most famous example of this adaptation, but they were far from unique. Across colonial America, accusations of supernatural transformation served the same function they had served in medieval Europe. They provided communities with a mechanism for eliminating inconvenient individuals while reinforcing social boundaries and demonstrating the consequences of nonconformity. But something else was happening during this period, something that reveals the true sophistication of the werewolf creation process. The techniques were becoming self-perpetuating. Communities that had experienced one round of monster making often found themselves repeating the process years or even decades later, sometimes targeting completely different types of individuals but using virtually identical methods. This wasn't coincidence. It was evidence that the werewolf creation process had become embedded in the social DNA of these communities. The knowledge of how to identify, isolate, and destroy human monsters had been passed down through informal networks, preserved in local customs, and integrated into the basic assumptions about how societies protect themselves from internal threats. The beauty of this system, from the perspective of those who deployed it, was its adaptability. The specific supernatural framework could change. The werewolf could become the witch, the heretic, the possessed, the seditious element, the enemy of the people. But the underlying process remained constant. Identify the target, isolate them from their support networks, systematically undermine their credibility and their sanity, extract confessions through psychological or physical pressure, and finally eliminate them in a public ritual that reinforced community boundaries. What made this particularly effective was the way it exploited fundamental aspects of human psychology that remain constant across cultures and historical periods. The need to belong, the fear of social isolation, the tendency to conform to group expectations, the willingness to participate in collective violence when it's sanctioned by authority figures. These vulnerabilities in human nature provided the raw material from which monsters could be manufactured. The 18th century brought new challenges and new opportunities for werewolf creation. The Age of Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason and scientific method, might have been expected to put an end to such practices. Instead, it simply forced them to evolve. The supernatural framework was gradually replaced by pseudo-scientific explanations, but the core techniques remained unchanged. Medical authorities began to describe lycanthropy as a form of mental illness, a disorder that could be diagnosed through specific symptoms and treated through established procedures. This medicalization of the werewolf served multiple functions. It preserved the essential process of monster making while clothing it in the language of scientific rationality. It transferred authority from religious figures to medical professionals, but maintained the same power dynamics, and it created new categories of human beings who could be designated as less than fully human while maintaining the appearance of humanitarian concern. The asylum system that emerged during this period represented a refined version of the werewolf creation process. Individuals who exhibited behaviors that challenged social norms could be diagnosed with various forms of mental disorder, isolated from their communities, subjected to treatments that often amounted to systematic torture, and eventually broken down to the point where they genuinely exhibited the symptoms they had been accused of possessing. The records from institutions like Bedlam in London or the Salpêtrière in Paris reveal the same patterns we saw in medieval werewolf trials, but clothed in medical terminology and justified through appeals to scientific authority. Patients were isolated, deprived of familiar social connections, subjected to treatments designed to break down their sense of self, and gradually transformed into the very monsters their diagnoses suggested they had always been. But the most significant development of this period was the emergence of what we might call the industrial werewolf. As societies became more complex and more interconnected, the techniques for creating monsters had to be scaled up to match. What had once required months of careful manipulation applied to individual targets could now be deployed against entire populations simultaneously. The key breakthrough was the recognition that monster making didn't have to be a one-on-one process. With the right techniques, it was possible to create the conditions where communities would essentially manufacture their own monsters, identifying and destroying internal enemies with minimal direction from external authorities. This required a more sophisticated understanding of mass psychology, but the basic principles remained the same. Create fear and uncertainty within the population. Provide them with a framework for understanding that fear that points toward internal enemies. Give them the tools and permission to identify those enemies. Then step back and allow the community to destroy itself while believing it's protecting itself. The French Revolution provides a perfect case study of this process in action. The techniques developed over centuries of werewolf trials were deployed on a massive scale, but now the monsters were aristocrats, counter-revolutionaries, enemies of the people. The specific supernatural beliefs had been replaced by political ideology, but the psychological mechanisms remained identical. Citizens were encouraged to watch their neighbors for signs of disloyalty. Accusation became indistinguishable from guilt. The absence of obvious evidence of counter-revolutionary activity was interpreted as proof of how cunning the accused had become at concealing their true nature. Confession was extracted through psychological pressure and the threat of violence, and the public executions served the same function that werewolf burnings had served centuries earlier, demonstrating the fate that awaited anyone who crossed the boundary from loyal citizen to enemy of the state. What made this particularly chilling was the speed at which ordinary citizens transformed into enthusiastic participants in mass murder. People who had lived peaceful lives, who had never shown any inclination toward violence, suddenly found themselves capable of the most extreme cruelty, when it was directed against individuals who had been designated as monsters. This transformation didn't happen through supernatural means. It was the result of psychological techniques that had been refined over centuries of practice. The same methods that had once been used to create individual werewolves were now being applied to entire populations, turning them into collective monsters while convincing them they were heroes engaged in necessary work of purification and protection. The 19th century brought new technologies and new opportunities for monster manufacturing. The printing press, improved transportation networks, and emerging forms of mass communication made it possible to coordinate werewolf creation across vast distances and diverse populations. What had once been localized phenomena could now be synchronized and amplified on scales that previous generations could never have imagined. The anti-Semitic movements that swept across Europe during this period represent perhaps the most sophisticated application of werewolf creation techniques ever developed. The process began with the systematic demonization of Jewish communities, but it went far beyond simple prejudice or religious intolerance. It involved the deliberate application of psychological techniques that had been refined over centuries of practice. Jewish individuals and communities were gradually isolated from their non-Jewish neighbors through a combination of legal restrictions, economic pressure, and social ostracism. Their cultural practices were reinterpreted as evidence of their fundamental alienation from human society. Their success in certain professions was presented as proof of their supernatural cunning and their predatory relationship with normal human beings. Most significantly, they were accused of transformation, of being something other than what they appeared to be. Just as medieval werewolves were said to take human form while concealing their bestial nature, Jewish communities were portrayed as human in appearance, but fundamentally different in their essential nature. This difference was presented as both invisible and absolutely crucial, something that could only be detected through careful observation and specialized knowledge. The techniques used to identify and eliminate werewolves were adapted and applied on an industrial scale. Entire populations were trained to recognize the subtle signs that supposedly revealed the true nature of their Jewish neighbors. Communities were encouraged to participate in acts of collective violence that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. And individuals who had been designated as monsters were subjected to systematic dehumanization that followed patterns established centuries earlier. What makes this historical example particularly important for our understanding is the way it demonstrates the scalability of werewolf creation techniques. The same psychological mechanisms that had once been used to transform individual peasants into confessed lycanthropes were now being deployed against millions of people simultaneously. The process had been industrialized, bureaucratized, and integrated into the machinery of modern state power. But the most chilling aspect of this development was the way it revealed the true purpose of werewolf creation. It wasn't really about eliminating supernatural threats or protecting communities from dangerous individuals. It was about demonstrating and reinforcing the power of those who controlled the monster-making process. It was about creating shared experiences of collective violence that bound communities together through complicity. And it was about establishing the principle that certain categories of human beings could be designated as no longer fully human and therefore no longer deserving of the protections normally accorded to members of society. The werewolf had evolved from a supernatural creature that haunted medieval forests into a sophisticated technology for social control that could be deployed by modern bureaucratic states. The specific targets changed. The justifying ideologies adapted to new circumstances, but the core process remained terrifyingly consistent across centuries of human history. And this brings us to perhaps the most disturbing realization of all: the techniques that were perfected through centuries of werewolf trials didn't disappear with the end of overtly supernatural belief systems. They were preserved, refined, and integrated into supposedly rational, scientific, and humanitarian institutions. They became part of the basic toolkit of modern governance, disguised by new terminology but fundamentally unchanged in their operation and their effects. The werewolf walks among us still, but it no longer needs to justify itself through appeals to supernatural transformation. It can operate through medical diagnoses, psychological evaluations, security assessments, social credit systems, and algorithmic determinations of risk and reliability. The monster-making machinery has become so sophisticated that most of its victims never realize they're being transformed, and most of its operators genuinely believe they're engaged in necessary and beneficial work. The true horror of the werewolf isn't that it might exist somewhere in the darkness beyond civilization. The true horror is that it exists at the very heart of civilization itself, woven into the basic structures and processes through which human societies organize themselves and maintain order. We didn't defeat the werewolf. We domesticated it, institutionalized it, and made it invisible. The monster was never the problem. The monster was always the solution, the tool through which human societies resolve their internal contradictions by designating certain individuals or groups as no longer fully human and therefore no longer deserving of moral consideration. The werewolf is humanity's most enduring invention, and we've never stopped using it because we've never stopped needing it. But understanding this process, recognizing its operation in our own time and our own society, gives us something that the victims of historical werewolf trials never had. It gives us the possibility of resistance, the chance to refuse participation in the monster-making machinery, the opportunity to recognize our common humanity, even when institutional forces are working to convince us otherwise. The werewolf may be humanity's darkest creation, but it's not our inevitable destiny. The same capacity for psychological manipulation that makes monster-making possible also makes human connection, empathy, and resistance possible. The question isn't whether the werewolf creation process continues to operate around us, because it obviously does. The question is whether we'll learn to recognize it, understand it, and find ways to protect ourselves and others from its effects. The machinery we've been examining didn't simply vanish with the dawn of the modern era. If anything, it became more sophisticated, more pervasive, and infinitely more dangerous as it adapted to the technologies and ideologies of the 20th century. What we're about to explore will reveal how the werewolf creation process reached its ultimate expression, transforming from a local phenomenon into a global system of unprecedented scope and efficiency. The breakthrough came with the recognition that mass media could serve the same function that village gossip and church sermons had served in earlier eras, but on a scale that medieval monster makers could never have imagined. Radio broadcasts, newspapers, and eventually television provided the perfect mechanisms for simultaneously implanting the same fears, the same expectations, and the same readiness to identify monsters across entire populations. And if you're finding this investigation as chilling as I am, you absolutely need to subscribe to Vanishing Legends right now, because we're just getting started. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because what comes next is going to show you how these historical techniques evolved into systems that operate all around us today, often in ways we never recognize. The genius of 20th century monster manufacturing lay in its ability to operate at multiple levels simultaneously. Local communities could be encouraged to identify and eliminate their own internal enemies using techniques that had been refined over centuries. But now these local processes could be coordinated, synchronized, and amplified through centralized propaganda systems that reached into every home, every workplace, every social gathering. Consider what happened in Germany during the 1930s. The techniques we've been tracing through centuries of werewolf trials were deployed with industrial precision against Jewish communities. But the process followed patterns that would have been instantly recognizable to medieval inquisitors. The same psychological mechanisms, the same social dynamics, the same transformation of ordinary citizens into enthusiastic participants in mass murder. But this wasn't simply a repetition of historical patterns. It was their perfection. The monster-making machinery had been refined, systematized, and integrated into the apparatus of a modern bureaucratic state. What had once required months of careful manipulation applied to individual targets could now be accomplished in weeks or even days when applied to entire populations. The process began with what we might recognize as a sophisticated marketing campaign designed to prepare the public for monster identification. Citizens were bombarded with messages that taught them to see their Jewish neighbors as fundamentally different, inherently threatening, and only masquerading as fellow human beings. The specific supernatural beliefs of medieval werewolf trials were replaced by pseudo-scientific theories about race and biology, but the psychological effect was identical. Jewish communities were gradually isolated from their non-Jewish neighbors through a combination of legal restrictions and social pressure. Their businesses were boycotted, their children excluded from schools, their participation in civic life systematically eliminated. This isolation served the same function it had served in medieval villages. It made the targeted population more vulnerable to psychological manipulation while removing potential witnesses who might contradict the accusations being prepared against them. The next phase involved the systematic demonization of Jewish cultural practices and religious observances. Rituals that had been part of community life for centuries were reinterpreted as evidence of alien loyalties and sinister purposes. The same techniques that had once been used to transform healing women into malevolent witches were now applied to transform respected members of the community into dangerous enemies of the state. But the most chilling aspect of this process was the way it transformed the accusers themselves. Ordinary German citizens, people who had lived peaceful lives and shown no previous inclination toward violence, found themselves capable of participating in acts of systematic cruelty that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. They didn't become monsters through supernatural transformation. They became monsters through their participation in a carefully orchestrated process of collective dehumanization. The techniques used to break down the psychological resistance of the targeted population followed patterns that had been established in werewolf trials centuries earlier. Individuals were subjected to public humiliation designed to strip them of their dignity and social standing. They were forced to wear identifying markers that made their designated status visible to everyone around them. They were gradually deprived of the legal protections and social connections that normally anchor human identity. Most significantly, they were subjected to systematic psychological pressure designed to make them doubt their own worth, their own humanity, their own right to exist. The same methods that had once been used to extract confessions of lycanthropy were now applied on an industrial scale to break down the will to resist, to survive, to maintain any sense of self-worth in the face of overwhelming institutional power. The final phase of this process involved the physical elimination of the targeted population. But this wasn't simply about murder. It was about demonstrating to the entire society the absolute power of the monster-making machinery and the fate that awaited anyone who might be designated as the next target. The elaborate rituals of destruction served the same function that public werewolf executions had served in medieval villages, reinforcing social boundaries while creating shared experiences of complicity that bound the community together through collective guilt. What makes this historical example particularly important for our understanding is the way it reveals the true scalability of werewolf creation techniques. The same psychological mechanisms that had once transformed individual peasants into confessed lycanthropes were now being deployed against millions of people simultaneously. The process had been industrialized, bureaucratized, and integrated into the machinery of modern state power. But this was far from the only application of these techniques during the 20th century. Similar patterns emerged in Stalin's Soviet Union, where entire classes of people were designated as enemies of the state and subjected to systematic elimination. The kulaks, the intellectuals, the ethnic minorities, the political dissidents, all became targets of monster-making processes that follow the same basic blueprint while adapting to local conditions and ideological requirements. In each case, the process began with the identification of internal enemies who were supposedly threatening the welfare of the broader community. These enemies were portrayed as fundamentally different from normal citizens, as masquerading as loyal members of society while secretly working toward its destruction. They were gradually isolated from their support networks, subjected to public humiliation and psychological pressure, and finally eliminated in ways that served as warnings to anyone who might be tempted to resist the system. The techniques were also deployed in colonial contexts, where indigenous populations were systematically dehumanized to justify their displacement and elimination. Native Americans, Australian Aborigines, African communities all became targets of monster-making processes that portrayed them as savage, primitive, and fundamentally incompatible with civilized society. The same psychological mechanisms that had once created werewolves were now creating racial enemies whose elimination could be justified through appeals to progress, development, and the march of civilization. What made these 20th century applications particularly sophisticated was their integration with emerging technologies of mass communication and social control. Radio broadcasts could simultaneously plant the same fears and expectations in millions of minds. Newspapers could coordinate the identification of enemies across vast geographical areas. Government bureaucracies could systematically track, categorize, and process targeted populations with unprecedented efficiency. But perhaps most significantly, these systems developed the ability to operate through supposedly rational, scientific, and humanitarian institutions. Medical professionals participated in programs of forced sterilization and euthanasia directed against individuals who were deemed genetically unfit. Social workers identified families that needed to be separated to protect children from supposedly harmful influences. Educators developed curricula that taught children to recognize and report the signs of disloyalty or deviance in their own families and communities. The monster-making machinery had become so sophisticated that most of its operators genuinely believed they were engaged in necessary and beneficial work. They weren't participating in acts of systematic cruelty. They were protecting public health, maintaining social order, advancing scientific knowledge, or defending national security. The werewolf creation process had learned to disguise itself as its opposite, presenting systematic dehumanization as humanitarian intervention. This development represents perhaps the most dangerous evolution in the entire history of monster manufacturing. When the process operates through institutions that are explicitly dedicated to human welfare, it becomes almost impossible to recognize or resist. The victims are told that their treatment is for their own good, for the protection of society. or for the advancement of human knowledge. The operators are convinced that their work serves higher purposes and contributes to human progress. The Cold War period brought new refinements to these techniques as competing ideological systems developed increasingly sophisticated methods for identifying and neutralizing internal enemies. The werewolf trials of medieval Europe had been crude affairs compared to the psychological operations, counterintelligence programs, and social control systems that emerged during this period. In the United States, programs like COINTELPRO deployed werewolf creation techniques against civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, and anyone else who challenged established power structures. The process followed familiar patterns. Targets were identified through surveillance systems that monitored their associations, activities, and expressions of dissent. They were gradually isolated from their support networks through disinformation campaigns that portrayed them as dangerous extremists or foreign agents. They were subjected to psychological pressure designed to break down their will to resist. And in many cases, they were eliminated through methods that maintained plausible deniability. Similar techniques were deployed by intelligence agencies around the world, often with the assistance of psychological professionals who provided scientific justification for methods that would have been instantly recognizable to medieval inquisitors. The specific ideological frameworks varied, but the underlying process remained constant. Identify internal enemies, isolate them from their communities, systematically undermine their credibility and their sanity, and eliminate them in ways that served as warnings to potential future dissidents. The beauty of these modern systems, from the perspective of those who operated them, was their deniability. Unlike medieval werewolf trials, which were public spectacles designed to demonstrate institutional power, 20th century monster making often operated in secret through bureaucratic processes that left few traces and could be justified through appeals to national security or public safety. Targets of these operations often never fully understood what was happening to them. They experienced a gradual deterioration in their circumstances, a mysterious series of setbacks and coincidences that seemed to follow no logical pattern. Their friends began to avoid them, their professional opportunities disappeared, their personal relationships became strained, their mental health deteriorated under the pressure of constant uncertainty and surveillance. Many genuinely came to believe that they were experiencing random misfortune, or that their problems were the result of their own inadequacies or mental instability. The monster-making process had become so subtle that its victims often participated in their own destruction, accepting the explanations provided by the very system that was targeting them. This psychological sophistication represents the culmination of centuries of refinement in werewolf creation techniques. The crude methods of medieval inquisitors, who relied on torture and public spectacle to achieve their goals, had evolved into systems of such subtlety that they could operate for decades without being detected or understood by their targets, their operators, or the general public. But the true genius of these modern systems lay in their ability to create self-perpetuating cycles of monster identification and elimination. Once established, they could operate with minimal oversight or direction, generating their own targets and justifying their own existence through the very threats they created. Intelligence agencies identified threats that required expanded surveillance powers. Medical institutions discovered disorders that required new forms of treatment. Educational systems identified students who needed special interventions. Social service agencies found families that required monitoring and control. Each institution developed its own version of the werewolf, its own categories of individuals who were deemed to pose special risks or require special attention. The specific criteria varied, but the underlying process remained constant. Certain categories of human beings were designated as potentially dangerous, systematically monitored for signs of deviance or disloyalty, and subjected to interventions designed to neutralize any threat they might pose to social order. What made this particularly insidious was the way these systems operated through institutions that were explicitly dedicated to human welfare and social progress. Hospitals, schools, social service agencies, and mental health facilities became key components in a vast machinery of social control that could identify and process potential dissidents before they became actual threats to established power structures. The werewolf had evolved from a supernatural creature that haunted medieval forests into a comprehensive system of social control that operated at every level of modern society. It no longer needed to justify itself through appeals to supernatural transformation or religious authority. It could operate through medical diagnoses, psychological evaluations, educational assessments, and bureaucratic determinations of risk and suitability. Most importantly, it had learned to present itself as its opposite, as a system dedicated to protecting human welfare rather than destroying it. The monster-making machinery had become so sophisticated that it could convince both its operators and its victims that systematic dehumanization was actually a form of humanitarian intervention. This brings us to perhaps the most disturbing realization of our entire investigation. The techniques that were developed through centuries of werewolf trials didn't disappear with the end of overtly supernatural belief systems, or even with the recognition of their historical abuses. They simply adapted to new technologies, new ideologies, and new institutional frameworks. The werewolf walks among us still, but it no longer announces itself through dramatic transformations or supernatural manifestations. It operates through algorithmic systems that can identify potential threats before they manifest. Through social credit systems that can track and modify behavior on a massive scale. Through psychological interventions that can reshape personality and eliminate inconvenient traits. Through educational programs that can identify and redirect deviant thinking patterns in children before they fully develop. The monster-making machinery has become so pervasive and so subtle that most of us participate in its operations without ever recognizing what we're doing. We provide the data that feeds its surveillance systems. We accept the diagnoses that justify its interventions. We participate in the social pressures that isolate its targets. We consume the media that shapes our perceptions of who deserves to be treated as fully human and who can be safely designated as something less. The true horror of the werewolf isn't that it might exist somewhere in the darkness beyond civilization. The true horror is that it has become civilization itself, the invisible machinery through which human societies maintain order by systematically identifying and eliminating anyone who challenges established power structures or fails to conform to approved patterns of behavior. We didn't defeat the werewolf. We perfected it, institutionalized it, and made it so much a part of our normal social operations that we can no longer see it clearly. The monster was never the problem. The monster was always the solution, the mechanism through which human societies resolve their internal contradictions by designating certain individuals or groups as no longer fully human and therefore no longer deserving of moral consideration. But recognizing this process, understanding its historical development and its contemporary manifestations, gives us something that the victims of werewolf trials throughout history never had. It gives us the possibility of conscious resistance, the chance to refuse participation in monster-making operations, the opportunity to recognize and defend our common humanity, even when powerful institutional forces are working to convince us that certain categories of people deserve to be treated as less than human. The werewolf may be humanity's most enduring and most sophisticated invention, but it's not our inevitable destiny. The same psychological vulnerabilities that make monster making possible also make human connection, empathy, and solidarity possible. The question isn't whether werewolf creation processes continue to operate around us, because they obviously do. The question is whether we'll learn to recognize them, understand them, and develop effective ways to protect ourselves and others from their effects. The question that haunts us as we reach the end of this investigation is perhaps the most chilling of all. If the werewolf creation process has become so sophisticated, so pervasive, so deeply embedded in the machinery of modern civilization, then how do we recognize it when it's happening around us? How do we identify the signs that someone is being transformed from a human being into a monster? Not through supernatural means, but through the systematic application of techniques that have been refined over centuries of practice. The answer lies in understanding that the process always follows the same fundamental pattern, regardless of the specific ideological framework or institutional context in which it operates. Whether we're talking about medieval werewolf trials or modern forms of systematic dehumanization, the underlying mechanics remain terrifyingly consistent. It begins with designation. Someone or some group is identified as fundamentally different from the rest of the community. This difference is portrayed as both invisible to casual observation and absolutely crucial to understand. They may look like us, the message goes. They may speak like us. They may even believe they are like us, but they are not. They are something else entirely, something that poses a threat to everything we hold dear. This designation is never random. It always serves specific political, economic, or social functions. The targets are chosen because their elimination will benefit someone, will resolve some tension within the community, will demonstrate the power of the institutions making the designation. The werewolf accusation isn't the cause of their destruction, it's the method, the tool that makes their elimination not only possible, but necessary and even righteous. The second phase involves isolation. The designated targets are gradually separated from their support networks through a combination of legal restrictions, social pressure, and psychological manipulation. Their friends begin to avoid them, their professional opportunities disappear, their family members distance themselves, they find themselves increasingly alone, increasingly vulnerable, increasingly dependent on the very institutions that are orchestrating their destruction. This isolation serves multiple functions. It makes the targets more susceptible to psychological manipulation by depriving them of the social connections that normally anchor human identity. It removes potential witnesses who might contradict the accusations being prepared. It creates a social vacuum around the targets that can be filled with whatever narrative their accusers choose to construct. The third phase involves systematic demonization. The target's beliefs, behaviors, and cultural practices are reinterpreted as evidence of their dangerous nature. Their successes become proof of their cunning manipulation. Their failures become evidence of their inherent deficiency. Their attempts to defend themselves become demonstrations of their deceptive nature. Every aspect of their existence is viewed through a lens that confirms their fundamental otherness and their threat to the community. The fourth phase involves the breaking of psychological resistance. The targets are subjected to constant pressure designed to make them doubt their own reality, their own worth, their own right to exist as they are. They may be subjected to formal interrogation, therapeutic intervention, educational remediation, or simply the relentless application of social pressure. The goal is always the same: to break down their sense of self until they begin to accept the designation that has been imposed upon them. The final phase involves elimination or transformation. In historical contexts, this often meant literal death, usually carried out in public rituals that reinforce community boundaries while demonstrating the power of the institutions involved. In modern contexts, it more often involves social death, professional destruction, or psychological transformation that leaves the targets fundamentally changed, no longer recognizable as the people they once were. But here's what makes contemporary werewolf creation particularly insidious. The process has become so sophisticated that it can operate through institutions that are explicitly dedicated to human welfare and social progress. Medical professionals diagnose disorders that require treatment. Educational specialists identify learning difficulties that need intervention. Social workers discover family problems that demand correction. Mental health experts recognize psychological conditions that call for therapy. In each case, the intervention is presented as being for the benefit of the target, designed to help them overcome their problems and integrate more successfully into society. The fact that these interventions often result in the systematic destruction of the target's autonomy, identity, and social connections is presented as an unfortunate but necessary side effect of the healing process. This is perhaps the most brilliant evolution in the entire history of monster manufacturing. The process has learned to disguise itself as its opposite, to present systematic dehumanization as humanitarian intervention. The operators genuinely believe they are helping people, and the targets are encouraged to view their own destruction as a form of treatment or education. But if you know what to look for, if you understand the historical patterns we've been exploring, the signs become unmistakable. When someone is gradually isolated from their support networks, when their beliefs or behaviors are pathologized rather than simply disagreed with, when their attempts to defend themselves are treated as evidence of their need for intervention, when they are subjected to procedures designed to reshape their fundamental sense of self, when their resistance is broken down through a combination of psychological pressure and institutional power. These are the hallmarks of werewolf creation, whether it's happening in a medieval village or a modern therapeutic facility. The specific justifications may change, the institutional frameworks may evolve, but the underlying process remains constant. And this brings us to the most crucial question of all. What can we do about it? How do we protect ourselves and others from becoming victims of monster-making processes that have become so sophisticated they can operate through institutions that are supposedly designed to help us? The first step is recognition. We must learn to see these patterns when they emerge, to recognize the signs that someone is being systematically dehumanized, even when that dehumanization is presented as being for their own good. We must develop the ability to distinguish between genuine efforts to help people and sophisticated forms of social control that use the language of helping to justify systematic destruction. The second step is resistance. When we recognize these patterns, we must find ways to interrupt them, to challenge the designations being imposed, to maintain human connections with people who are being isolated and demonized. This is not always easy or safe, as the history we've explored makes clear. Those who challenge monster-making processes often find themselves designated as the next targets. But resistance is possible, and it's necessary. Throughout history, there have always been individuals who refuse to participate in collective acts of dehumanization, who maintain their recognition of common humanity, even when powerful institutional forces were working to convince them otherwise. These people didn't always succeed in preventing specific tragedies, but they preserved something essential about what it means to be human. The third step is the development of alternative institutions and social structures that can provide support and protection for people who are being targeted by monster-making processes. Communities of resistance that can offer material assistance, emotional support, and alternative narratives that challenge the designations being imposed by dominant institutions. Here at Vanishing Legends, we believe that understanding these historical patterns is crucial for recognizing their contemporary manifestations. The monsters we fear from the past didn't disappear. They evolved, adapted, and found new forms of expression in our modern world. By studying their historical development, we can learn to see them clearly in their current incarnations. The fourth step involves the reconstruction of social bonds based on genuine recognition of shared humanity, rather than on collective participation in acts of exclusion and violence. This means developing communities that can include rather than exclude, that can support individual differences rather than demanding conformity, that can resolve conflicts through dialogue rather than through the designation and elimination of internal enemies. This is perhaps the most challenging aspect of resisting werewolf creation processes, because they serve real functions within human societies. They provide mechanisms for managing internal tensions, for demonstrating institutional power, for creating shared experiences that bind communities together. Simply opposing them without providing alternative ways of meeting these needs is likely to be ineffective. But alternatives are possible. Human societies have occasionally developed forms of organization that can manage conflict without requiring the systematic dehumanization of internal enemies. These examples are rare and often fragile, but they demonstrate that the werewolf is not humanity's inevitable destiny. The fifth and final step involves the cultivation of psychological and spiritual practices that can maintain individual and collective resistance to monster-making processes. This means developing the inner resources that allow people to maintain their sense of self and their recognition of others' humanity, even under extreme pressure. It means creating cultural practices that celebrate rather than suppress human diversity. It means fostering forms of education that teach critical thinking, rather than uncritical acceptance of authority. Most importantly, it means learning to recognize the werewolf within ourselves, the capacity for dehumanization that exists in every human being and can be activated under the right circumstances. The people who participated in historical monster-making processes were not fundamentally different from us. They were ordinary human beings who found themselves in situations where systematic cruelty became not only acceptable, but necessary and even heroic. Understanding this about ourselves, recognizing our own vulnerability to these processes, may be the most important step we can take toward preventing their recurrence. The monster is not them. The monster is us, under the right circumstances, with the right pressures applied, with the right justifications provided. But this recognition, rather than being cause for despair, can be the foundation for genuine hope. If the capacity for monstrous behavior is learned rather than innate, if it's the result of specific social processes rather than fundamental human nature, then it can be unlearned, resisted, and replaced with something better. The werewolf represents humanity's capacity for systematic dehumanization, but it also represents our capacity for choice. In every historical situation we've examined, there were individuals who chose differently, who refused to participate in collective acts of violence, who maintained their recognition of common humanity even when doing so put them at risk. These choices are still available to us. Every day, in small ways and large, we encounter situations where we can choose to see others as fully human or as something less than human. We can choose to participate in systems that dehumanize and destroy. or we can choose to build alternatives that recognize and celebrate our shared humanity. The werewolf will always be with us because the capacity for dehumanization is built into the structure of human consciousness and human society. But so is the capacity for recognition, empathy, and love. The question is not whether we can eliminate the werewolf entirely, but whether we can learn to recognize it, understand it, and choose something better. This is the real lesson of our investigation into the werewolf as a man-made monster. It's not a story about supernatural creatures that haunted medieval forests. It's a story about human choices, human institutions, and human possibilities. It's a story about what we've done to each other throughout history, but it's also a story about what we might choose to do differently. The werewolf is humanity's darkest invention, but it's not our final word. We created the monster, but we also have the power to uncreate it, to choose different stories, to build different institutions, to cultivate different forms of consciousness. The transformation is possible, but it requires us to see clearly what we've been doing, to understand how we've been doing it, and to commit ourselves to doing something better. The choice is ours, as it has always been. The werewolf walks among us still, but so does the possibility of its transformation. The question is not whether we have the power to change these patterns, but whether we have the wisdom and the courage to use that power for healing rather than for harm. Thank you for joining me on this dark journey through the hidden history of humanity's most enduring monster. If this investigation has opened your eyes to patterns you hadn't seen before, if it's helped you understand the mechanisms through which human beings can be systematically dehumanized, then it's served its purpose. The knowledge is uncomfortable, but it's necessary. Only by understanding how monsters are made can we hope to stop making them. The werewolf may be our creation, but it doesn't have to be our destiny. The transformation begins with recognition, continues with resistance, and finds its completion in the choice to see and treat each other as fully, irreducibly, magnificently human. The monster is real, but so is the possibility of its redemption. The choice, as always, is ours.